Welcome back. In this video, we are going to take care of our timer here at the bottom left, and we will implement it using code. So of course, we will need to create a new script if we want to use code, and therefore we're going to use Visual Studio once again. And I'd say, let's get started. So let's go ahead and first of all, create a new folder here inside of our assets folder. And I'm going to call this one scripts. Inside of the scripts folder, I'm going to create a new script because, well, that's what we want to do. We want to add a new behavior to our game. And I'm going to call this game controller. Okay, so this will be our controller that takes care of the game controller. And in this particular case, we're going to keep it simple. So we're really just going to have this one script that takes care of the mechanics of our game because there's really not that much going on in our game. So what's the goal of the script for now? Well, at least for this video, the goal is to display the time here. And in order to display the time and not just the text time as it does right now, if we look at our canvas here, we can find that we have this time text. What we want to do instead is we want to change this dynamically. So the text that will be displayed in our time text should be changed dynamically based on how long our game has been running, or basically a timer should run down. So these would be the different options that we have. So let's first of all create an object inside of our script that will take care of that. And I'm going to create a new object here, public text. And you might recall, if you want to use text, you need to use the Unity Engine UI namespace, like so, as we have done before. So now I can create a text object. So here a text variable, so to speak, and I'm going to call this one time field. So this will be our time field where we want to display our time. Now, in order to build a timer, we need to look at something called time.deltatime. All right, so let's look at time.deltatime. Time.deltatime is a read-only float value that represents the interval in seconds from the last frame to the current one. So basically, every single frame a certain time has passed. And getting the time that has passed since the last frame can be received by using time.deltatime. Delta basically means the difference, and what we want to get is the difference in time. So to be able to move something in a constant way, we always use time instead of frames, since depending on hardware, frames can change, but time will give us the same result. So for example, if you have a PC that makes your game run at 100 frames per second and you want to move an object at 100 meters per second, you would think of just moving it 1 meter each frame. But as soon as the same game drops frames, the speed of the object will decrease too, since it's linked to the FPS, so to the frames per second. That won't happen when using delta time, which is why we're going to do that. For instance, multiply speed by time.deltatime and you will get exactly the distance moved by the object since the last update. So update was the method in our code. If we could look at it real quick, it's here and it is called every single frame. So once per frame, this update method will be called, which means the time between the update calls will be basically our delta time. And that will be the time that it takes for one frame to be displayed properly. So here you can see that these bars, for example, would be one update call. And then there is the time between the update calls, which would be, for example, a delta t of 0.1 seconds. So for in this particular case, let's say we have 10 frames per second, the game would be unplayable, but in 1 second we would have 10 frames. So it's better to actually make a game run based on delta time rather than on frames itself. So another example of time.deltatime is to decrement or increment time at constant rates. So if you wanted to, like in our case here, to show elapsed time in a game, you would show it by using this. So by using the time.deltatime. You can use time.deltatime inside the update, inside of coroutines or fixed update. And Unity returns the time since the last fixed update in the case of using fixed update. So there are different kinds of update methods, for example, the fixed update, the update, and the late update. For now, we're just using the update method, but just be aware there is also this method called fixed update. We're going to use it later on and see what it does, and then late update, and we're going to see what that does also. And they have a certain advantage and really important to use as well, but we're going to use them later. But using fixed update is not a good option on UI because this function is called several times between frames. So now let's get into implementing this functionality. First of all, we'll need to have a variable that will take care of time. And this variable can be private because we don't want to set that variable outside of our script, but only use it inside of the script itself. And the variable type will be float, because time is something where you don't only have whole numbers, but you need to use floating point numbers, which is why we're using this data type float. And float can hold values such as 3.1, and you see we need to add the f here to indicate that this is a float. Otherwise, it would be considered as a double. So once you hover over here, you can see struct system double. Double is just a different type of floating point numbers, but it's more precise than float. But at the same time, it requires more space. Okay, so it will require more memory. That's why we're going to use float here. We don't need to use unnecessary memory. But of course, I don't want to set the time here when creating it, but I actually want to set the time inside of my update method. So here I need to use time plus equal time dot delta time. So what will happen here is time will take its older value that it had before, and it will add the time that has passed since the last frame. So here this time class, you can see class Unity Engine time, is also part of the Unity Engine framework, so we can use it in our project. And conveniently enough, it has a different color here as well. So it's this greenish color that it has. And then we can use dot and the property that we want to access. So here we are accessing a property called delta time. And that's exactly what we need. So the completion time in seconds since the last frame. So this could be, let's say we have 1 frame per second, then this would be 1. So delta time would return a value of 1. If we have 10 frames, then it will return 0.1. If we have 100 frames, it would return 0.01. Okay, so that's what delta time will give us, and we'll basically add it to our time variable that we have here. So this plus equal, let's look at that real quick. So let's say we had time plus 5 currently would give us 5. Okay, because time currently is empty, and if it's empty, by default in C#, it will have the value of 0. So we would calculate 0 plus 5, and that equals 5. When we run this the next time, our time will be 5. So time plus another 5 would, for example, be 10. Because at that point, time has been assigned the value of 5. And that's what this plus equal does. It basically just says, okay, whatever was the value that time had before, add whatever comes after this equal sign here. So in this case, the delta time value, which will also be a floating point number. So you can add floating point values to floating point values because our time is also a float. Okay. Okay, now let's save our script. And let's go back to Unity. And inside of Unity, we will now need to create a new game object. So create empty. And I'm going to call this one game controller, like so. And this game controller, I'm going to reset its position because it's always good if your items are reset, if you don't need them to be at a specific spot. And then we're going to add a component. And the component that I want to add is going to be the game controller script. So you can search for game controller. That's the name of the script that we just created. So let's add that here. And you will see that now we have added the script. And at the same time, there is this time field that we need to assign. And it needs a text. So it says none, which means it's empty at this point. So what is going to be the item that we want to assign to it? Well, it's inside of our canvas. because here we have our time text, this one, and we want to drag it into our game controller's time field. So what you can do is you can select it from here, just click on this dot here, and then select the time text. Or you can drag the time text, of course, from your hierarchy over into your inspector. Okay, at this point, if we run our game, nothing will happen, or there won't be much happening because we never actually changed this time field. But at least we have assigned it here to our Unity game controller script. So yeah, now let's go ahead and actually change our code so that it will display the time instead. Therefore, we get our time field now, and we can set the time field value, so its text property, to be the time. Now that unfortunately doesn't work. And if you were super careful, you will know why. And that is because this text here expects a string. So if we were to pass something like time, that would work. But unfortunately, that wouldn't really be the time. But we want to have the time value from our update property. So how can we get that in there? And well, basically we need to convert this floating point value into a string, so basically into a text. So instead of having, let's say 5.5, what we want to have is 5.5, like this, inside of quotation marks. Then it would be a string. So in order to get that, what we can use is time dot to string. So there is this method called toString, which in our case converts the float into a string, which basically means that it will convert our time value, our floating point value, into a text, which then can be assigned to the text of my time field. Okay, and this will be fine. So at this point, let's go ahead and save our script once again. Let's go back over to Unity, and now let's run our game once it's entirely loaded and imported. And we will see our timer is running. Okay, so in the next video, we're going to start preparing a hidden word by using a random word from an array. Therefore, we need to understand what arrays are. So see you in the next video where we're going to check that out.